So these are some of the reasons why critical realism has been interesting for me. The second aspect, though, that in addition to the interpretive, meaningful dimension of mechanisms that I think differentiates it, say, from relational realism, is the emphasis on a kind of the critical aspect of critical realism, the ethical, critical, normative dimension. And this is the part of critical realism that I think is less well elaborated and less well understood as of yet. But the programmatic impulse or the drive is to reconnect normative, ethical, and analytical thinking somehow. And one of the ways in which Roy Bhaskar tried to do this, for example, was to argue for normative implications of analytical statements, to try and derive critical statements from descriptive or analytical statements about the world. I am not totally convinced by that. I'm not sure I completely understand that, but at least I think it does move in the right direction, which is to reconnect critique with social science. I think Pierre Bourdieu has perhaps provided a better, or at least an alternative approach to reconnecting relatively autonomous analytical science with practical political interventions in the real world. The pragmatist turn in some of sociology is another example of an attempt to reconnect those two. This is another part of sociology that I think is quite necessary and quite exciting nowadays. And in the social sciences more general is this sort of normative turn, an attempt to move beyond simple understandings of value-free science and value-free social science and to move beyond that together. Yeah.
A minute ago, you referred to the natural sciences as also being open. And what I take from that is that you would agree that the social sciences, and sociology in particular, in a way are kind of inherently open.
Yes.
And what I mean by that, I would like to test this idea out with you, is that there's no kind of exhaustive statement of what the program of explanatory and theoretical research is for sociology. Instead, there are always new questions. There are always new hypotheses about mechanisms. It's just unintelligible to think, well, eventually we'll come to closure and then we've got it all. Does that make sense to you, or?
Well, it's impossible. It's unthinkable that we would eventually come to closure for two reasons. One is that there's always the irrational hiatus between concept and object. We can never take a photograph of a causal mechanism, and because of that, models and pictures and theories are always only going to be approximations. That's the so-called irrational hiatus. And then the second reason is because of the inherent historicity of mechanisms in the social sciences. Even if we were able somehow, through some magical feat, to map all of the mechanisms that are operative in society as we now know it, there's no reason to expect that would be the same set of mechanisms in the future, or that it was the same set of mechanisms in the past. And so the impossibility for final closure is built into the nature of the historical world, the social world itself. Now, arguably, it's also built into the natural world. I mean, even though natural mechanisms are perhaps generally more durable across time and space than social mechanisms, some of them, for example, the mechanisms that make up life, are the biological mechanisms, are limited to a certain, perhaps, period of space-time, and so this is not a difference of quality, but of quantity, perhaps, the difference between natural and human mechanisms. That human science mechanisms tend to be probably more specific to times and places, but again, there could, I guess, I'm on thin ice here as a non-natural scientist, but philosophically, it seems to me, and also based on what we know about the natural world, there's no reason to expect us ever to achieve a final vision of the mechanisms in the natural sciences either. Is there?
Well, there might be.
There might be, yeah.
A physicist might say there is a small number of governing laws
That's
of
true.
energy, matter, propagation, and once we've got those laws, in theory, we've fixed all natural behavior.
Including the biological mechanisms of human life?
Yeah, if you are a physicalist, then you believe that genes, for example, are themselves just complex molecules.
With no emergent properties?
Right.
The mechanisms have no emergence?
Right.
So this would be a version of natural sciences that believes there are no emergent properties
Exactly.
even in the natural world.
Right.
Okay.
though there are people like Nancy Cartwright, who, it's not that she would advocate for emergent properties, but she does reject the statement that I just made, that there's a governing set of laws which
Right.
generate all natural phenomena.
Right.
And she prefers, it's one of the reasons I really like her work, she prefers the causal mechanisms approach, even for the natural sciences. So you're right to say that there's some lively debate on the natural science side. On the social science side, I think the openness is more radical and more fundamental. I seem to remember a passage from Weber, maybe you'll think of it if it really is a passage, in which he talks about studies of the Roman Empire and makes the point that for every generation, there is a new history of the Roman Empire.
A new history of the Roman Empire, yeah.
And that's not because the Roman Empire changes
Yeah.
with each generation, but that interest changes.
Yeah.
And there are new empirical studies to be done
Yeah.
in order to answer that new set of questions.
Yeah, yeah. Yes, that's also true, is that with each generation, the same historical object can be is revisited with a new set of theoretical interests.
George, I'd like to thank you for this really excellent discussion, and
Thanks, Dan.
we will continue.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, we could continue.